don't know about you, but I'm bursting with questions after all of that. But I'm going to take a back seat, which doesn't come naturally to me as a journalist, and let you ask the questions. Now, before I'm going to ask whoever wants to volunteer to answer the definition of populism question.
Oh, that's the difficult
Looks
one.
around the class. Otherwise, I'll pick on someone.
Yeah, I just think that it's become an interesting default for everything that people see happening, as opposed to a comment that actually defines what's happening. I think it's become like a catch-all phrase when people can't explain what's happening in the circumstances of politics right now. They bring it down to a definition of something called populism. I actually think that Nando had some interesting insights on that. It's about a certain type, we describe it as rhetoric, a certain type of rhetoric, a certain type of campaign, a certain set of issues that we want to take a look at. I guess the objection that I have to it is that I think that there are campaigns many times that can be described as populist that aren't decisive. It takes a combination of some of this stuff happening plus a particular type of political system or circumstance to actually make it powerful. So, for example, in the United States, Donald Trump lost the popular vote by like 2.5 million votes or something. I don't know what the exact number is now, Cliff, but so you have to sit back and say populist means that there's this great outpouring of support for everything that he was standing for, and there actually wasn't. There was a decisive group of people in some very specific places that allowed him to win. Would I call that populist? Until I find a better term, maybe I will, but I think we can do better than that. I think there's something else. There's this nativist element. There's this sense that the progress has ended. That's a big driver of what we saw in the United States. There's this sense of the other, an anti-immigrant type of a situation that you're seeing in many European countries, and you certainly saw in the U.S. Is that populist? I'm not quite sure that's the right term.
Does anyone want to come in?
Well, I'll just, those of you who follow the Ipsos MORI Issues Index in the UK will know that we have the highest ever level of anxiety about inequality and poverty this month. But of course, all official figures show that although inequality worsened greatly during the 1980s, as we moved to a post-industrial society, since then, actually, there hasn't been much change. But what you're seeing is the result of, obviously, it's globalization, it's migration, which is linked to that, and then, of course, the crash, and then living standards that have been, in some countries, under a lot of pressure, in many countries certainly not improving in the way that people were led to expect at the end of in the last decades of the 20th century. And you're seeing all of those things coming together. But of course it is ironic that in both Britain and America, unemployment is at a record low. Instead, of course, we and many of you in this room are grappling with we have a recovery which is about it's an in-work recovery, but it's still in-work. We still have a big challenge with in-work poverty and incomes not making. So it's a different set of circumstances. So all of those things are there, but they aren't. If you read Steven Pinker or anybody else, actually we're better off. We have more stuff, etc., etc. But we don't feel it. And this is what's interesting in both our commercial work and our politics work. What you're seeing, and I think one thing that populism is about, it's about emotion. It's not about the social democratic rational policies that we had until relatively recent. Instead, it's about emotion, it's about feeling, it's about style, and actually its relation to actual reality doesn't seem to matter quite as much. And with the internet giving us algorithms that give us more of what we like, all of these things seem to come together with a set of events, dear boy, that bring us to where we are. But it's not, I think we're still as a historian, I think we're still much too close to it to know if we've crossed some Rubicon and we're in some bold new age. We're probably not.
But the dictionary definition, isn't it, is of populism is, as opposed to popularity, it's about channeling the wishes of the masses against the elite. The idea is of the elite being corrupt and somehow, dodgy is very important to populism. And that's, I think, what it ties in with something what you were saying about the system being broken.
Yeah, I have a lot to say, but I won't talk that long. Brace yourself. No, to the specific question about is systems broken correlated with other sort of objective outcomes? Not necessarily. And this is to Ben's point, actually, if you take the United States, there's a widespread belief that the system is broken, that America's on the wrong track. 67% of Americans believe that. But if you ask them personally how they're doing financially, economically, they're doing very well. And there is
It wasn't the poorest who voted for Trump, was it?
no, it wasn't. That's the
Yeah,
point. And so the point is, at least in the U.S. context, let's talk about the U.S. context right now. The rationale is a little bit different. So I didn't vote for Trump because I need a job. I voted for Trump because America is a place where anyone who wants to work hard should get a job. The point is it's spiritual and cultural, not necessarily economic. That doesn't mean that economics isn't the precursor, the necessary condition, right? But ultimately it's not the sufficient condition. Right? And just going to these, because this issue about system is broken is linked to, I believe, these sort of other 2 points, and more specifically to the definition of populism. I think it's thrown around, you're definitely right. Populism means versus the elites, the popular will being felt, being realized. But when we think of populism, especially from a pejorative standpoint, because many times when we say populism, something's populist, we're talking in pejorative terms. That concept came out of Latin America and understanding the populist regimes in Latin America. And there's a strong anti-institutional, strong leader component to the definition. Now, I don't like the definition of populism either. I think it's very vague and diffuse. But going back to the initial point, there's this sort of syndrome, whether we call it populism or something else, there's this belief that the system is broken. It could be broken or not, for real. But there's a belief that it is. There's a belief that your country, the body that you identify with is slipping away. And it's the fault of someone else. It could be elites, it could be foreigners. Many times populism in Latin America was a function of anti-Americanism. The boogeyman, the boogie woman, the boogie person, were the Americans. But a belief that the system, the country is slipping away, belief that elites or others are the cause of it, and the need and belief that a strong leader is the only one that can take it back. So the last point about populism is there's a strong anti-institutional willingness to break the rules to take back the country. And so that's kind of my take. The system is broken is not correlated with real outcomes necessarily. I believe it's much more cultural and spiritual than economic, though the economy or economics is a necessary condition. When we think of populism in the Latin American sense, it's about anti-institutionalism. But beliefs are not sufficient. You need a political entrepreneur to take advantage, and this is the point that Daryl was making, you need the opportunity structure to take advantage of these sort of more populist or those anti-institutional feelings.
I very much agree with what Cliff says about the regimes in South America. But one can then argue, can a leader be populist if we say it is the masses versus the elites? And I think in our country we've seen definitely that the leader can be populist because he keeps on finding scapegoats, making promises, demonizing the other. There's always somebody that's responsible and not himself, or whether it's the past or whether it's the latest term is white minority capitalism, of which he also accuses the deputy president of, which So to a large degree, I think this whole issue revolves about the wild promises making, the fact that there is somebody that is the other, the demon, the one that's the fly in the ointment the whole time.
Mori, did you want to come on? Mori, when you were talking about the findings from France, there was this very strong sense that, of ascenseur social failing, that sense that, you're not going to do better in the next generation than you are now. Does that actually accord with reality?
Not always. For instance, on purchase power, it does not relate to reality. I think there is an important element to take into account is that perceptions are facts. And we do communicate regularly about what we call periods of perception. There is a difference between the perception and the reality. But this is a very important piece of information in itself. It tells us a lot about what happens. And to come back a little bit on the question of populism, I think it's very important to say, because it's about perception, it's about also a style of communication, as Nando said, and a style of action, addressing the concerns real or felt by a certain category of people who feel in disarray now or having lack of perspective, and a certain way to address that concern, and say the system is broken, we need to change something, the elite don't care about you, etc. This is why populism can be on the left side, on the right side. This is also why populism is always the fact of the other ones. But I think I think Nando touched an important point about the tone, the style of the action and communication, not only communication but also action. And yes, it relates a lot to perception, and in particular to specific perceptions on a category of people within a given country, but not always related to reality. Is the healthcare system working that bad? Is the unemployment that high? Has our purchase power declined so much? Are there that many foreigners in the country? Is such or such social issue a real threat? No, but the perception is there and fuels the call for action.
Which obviously puts politicians in a difficult position, because how do you respond to things that are felt but not actually true? Nando, did you want to come in on this? Right, so 3 questions there. Firstly, from I'm sorry that you're feeling negative, gentleman in the middle, but do we have any positive, cheery, uplifting examples of populism making the world a nicer place? Do we think this is related to historical distance from past conflict and perhaps the last rise of populism in the 30s? I think it might be relevant there. What age groups we're talking about in terms of voters attracted to populist policies. And finally, apart from the question on devolutionism, which some of you might like to pick up, I'm sure you'd all love to tell us what comes next after this period that we're only just starting to understand now. So as one of those questions was for Daryl, I think I better come to him first.
Oh, I like the term evolutionism. I think that could be something that's interesting. The problem is, usually when you're thinking of evolution, you're thinking of progress, and I'm not necessarily seeing what's going on right now as progress. You know, it kind of relates back to the question that was raised at the back when somebody said, Prince Charles said that we're forgetting some of the lessons of the Holocaust. It's a bit of a stark thought, but it's something worth pondering. So I don't know if it's evolutionary. It could be devolutionary. It might be going in the other direction. As far as something as positive in all of this, I think back to my Newton and the laws of physics, and every action continues in the same direction until it's intercepted by something else that changes its direction. And I think that if there's a positive that comes out of this, I think hopefully that people are going to see that politics matters. And the people who are opposed to some of the things that we're seeing out there are going to start thinking that maybe I do need to participate, maybe I do need to become politically active, maybe I do need to become informed, maybe I do need to vote, because if I don't, remember I mentioned before, there's political circumstances and situations that need to be combined with, for want of a better term, populism, that create these kinds of weird sorts of outcomes like we saw in the United States, we saw in the Brexit. We saw some things that, people are really sitting back right now and saying, is this the country that I want to have for the future? So maybe what it is an impetus for the other side to start getting itself organized and starting to take these things as seriously as the people who have been victorious over the last while. So if I could see a positive in this, I'd say maybe a more vigorous politics. And just to step back, one thing that I do see as really being under pressure right now is not the right, not the left, but the middle. That compromise that used to run so many countries, where there was kind of like an understanding among the people who did run the political system, maybe the elites if we want to look at it in a pejorative sense, that compromise that used to exist in many countries, even in a place like Canada, by the way, is starting to evaporate, and has evaporated a fair amount, where things are becoming starker choices between two different options, and that point of compromise is something that's being challenged. So I guess I would say that is, while I see people becoming more involved in politics, the outcome might be that compromise is affected in a negative way.
Just out of interest, does anyone on the panel have a good word to say for populism? Can anyone think of a populist movement that has achieved something worthwhile and beneficial to the nation?
Do you want to go?
I'm not necessarily want to say a good word about populism, but the whole issue at the moment in our country, as I said just before I finished my talk, was about the fact that I think civil society is definitely increasing in popularity in our country, and there's really a realization, and that's the positive thing for me, is that there's a realization that we need to take our country back from the politicians. And amongst the young people specifically, there's a feeling that transcends all the barriers of race, of income, of all those things, that they say we are in this together, and the politicians are not doing a good job of it. So I think that's the positive thing for us.
Yeah, you know, what was your question? Oh, yeah, because I have so many questions here.
You can say what you like, but the
I'll
other
say
thing
everything.
it was can you think of anything
Oh, he
beneficial?
will.
Oh, beneficial, yeah, that's right.
This is the will of the people, the will
Yeah,
of
I
the
have
masses.
a,
Functioning democracy.
yeah, I have a attention span of a gnat. Sorry about that. Or maybe it's the awesome Italian wine. But, you know, if you take the Latin American case, which I know well, while many of these societies, governments over-rotated in terms of heterodox policies that had long-term negative impacts, there was a lot of increased income inequality and social equality and social mobility. So that's a positive case. Okay, maybe long-term in Venezuela, you wrecked the economy, but you did distribute wealth. Maybe in Brazil, you over-rotated too much and you broke the bank in terms of the government budget. But you had widespread social mobility and a growth of the middle class. And that brings me to the point, thinking especially about the West, because really what we're talking about, for the most part, is the Western industrialized world, the Western industrialized democracies. This was my point initially when I was talking, that I believe the new supercycle is going to be about, in my lifetime, and I said this a number of times on record, I believe the rest of my professional lifetime, we're going to be talking about instability in the United States and Europe, not stability. But we have to, you know, think a bit about this. And this is, to what extent is this a corrective action to neoliberalism and to the fact that elites were not listening to the masses and were not delivering to their basic needs? To what extent is this a reaction to, in some ways, the weakening of the nation state and the general will, the general cultural orientation, not making a value judgment about it, but to what extent is it that? I think obviously these sorts of things, I'm an optimist long-term, a lot of these sort of populist swings are corrective actions. There's nefarious side to many of these, both in Latin America, and that was pure economic populism. What I believe we're seeing in the Western world is cultural populism. There are obviously there's a negative, as I was saying, nefarious side, but to what extent are we seeing actually a corrective action in some ways too, longer term? And that's something to think about. Like, we can't see this all as negative. The will of people is not being realized in certain ways, and what we're seeing is actually, you know, in some ways, we're hearing that voice now.
Ben, do you want to come in? I mean, obviously, to 52% of Britons, Brexit was a positive thing.
Yes,
and to half
well,
of Americans,
I
President
think,
Trump is
a lot
probably
of the
a positive thing.
people who voted for Brexit didn't actually expect it to happen. But nevertheless, no, absolutely. For a lot of people, this is positive. And I think a metropolitan liberal elite down here in London sipping Prosecco, we just have to keep reminding ourselves of this, that out there in small towns and other parts of Britain and the cities that we all come from, people do hold a very different view. But actually, the other thing I'd say to Mervyn is that most things happen and most people get into politics because actually, usually, they're trying to stop something else happening that they didn't like, or they're getting in, and this is a difficult one, that people generally do things for negative reasons. You know, Nigel Farage is active in politics because he didn't like something. He's not doing it because of, yes, he does have some vision of Britain as it may or may not have been in the 1950s, but he's doing it because he's against something. And that, to be honest, in all of our work, both local and national, often turns out to be the things. My ancestors in Essex in the 1840s were against what they saw. You know, they wanted a popular vote to be introduced, so they were Chartists, but they were against the status quo. So it's generally people do things because, and that's a creative force in our society. I do think just the other point about generational change, and Bobby Duffy, who's sitting in the front row, is known to many of you, but has been spending a lot of the last 5 or 6 years looking at this generational shift. But actually, interestingly, on some of those differences, when we look at attitudes towards some aspects of populism that veer to, or have that Mussolini might recognise, it is interesting how stark the differences are between Spain and Germany and France. And the French, of course, liking for a strong leader, and Henri is much better placed to talk about this than me. That isn't necessarily wanting a dictator, but it is something about Gaullism and some of French history. And what, you know, we're all seeing these local histories playing out in different ways. ways with all of this. So I think history does still matter. But what comes next, I don't know.
History's not much of a guide on that one. So we've got 3 questions there. Why does left-wing populism not seem to be as popular, so to speak, as right-wing populism? Is this connected in some way, perhaps, to the rise of emerging countries and a feeling of sort of competition and threat, and that, you know, makes us anxious about our decline relative to their rise? And thirdly, a very good question there: why, if everyone's against elitists, do we seem to be voting for a billionaire with inherited wealth, for example, or a stockbroker from Kent to be our champions of the proletariat? And can I ask Ben to start with?
Oh, thank you very much. I mean, I think my colleague Jonathan's just, it's because of the anti-immigration element, and the left has very mixed views on immigration. So there's part of the Labour Party, you know, unions used to be quite anti-immigration. It's quite divided. And I think the other thing we're seeing in terms of recent Labour Party history here is just the crisis of social democracy, and that's this, you know, which we see in many countries. Social democracy, it's very difficult to be a very angry centrist, you know, the angry middle. It doesn't really work when people are feeling, you know, it's fine to be a social democrat and to be generous about things when things are going well. When people are feeling threatened, uneasy, uncomfortable, telling them that we've all got to be rational and share doesn't go down very well. So and there's a series of timing and political events. But it is that, I think that is in part one, and actually in some parts of Greece. And of course, very populist left-wing parties are almost some form of communism, I suppose, which again has a number of issues in Europe. But why do we vote for elites, to kick out other elites? And the President of the United States bringing in, of course, promising to drain the swamp and get rid of Hillary Clinton with her crooked connections with Goldman Sachs, and then appoint, I don't know if it's 4 or 6 senior Goldman Sachs people to his administration, is, as Nando has pointed out, is sort of somewhat ironic. But I think it's all about style. It's Berlusconi had good style. Trump has style. It cuts through, and it goes to a certain level of cynicism that the public has about politicians. They know they know Trump is, not PC in terms of his approach to women or all sorts of people. They know all that stuff, but they think everybody's alike. And part of Trump's campaign, and I'd be interested in my North American colleagues' view on this, actually played into that cynicism to encourage people not to vote, which of course then helps him win. But at the same time, he's saying things that resonate. He's doing it in a style that's different. He isn't, whatever we think about him. Yes, he's a billionaire, but he's not part of the Republican Democratic machine in North America. And Nigel Farage may be a metals trader educated at Dulwich College, not particularly the man on the street. But his style, again, is not like David Cameron. It's not like Ed Miliband, or certainly not, of course, like Jeremy Corbyn. So again, it's that sort of, when you listen to Nigel Farage, he sounds like a perfectly reasonable bloke down the pub, and he's on the Today programme and every other political show on a regular basis, doing that. Now, the fact that he's not doesn't seem to come into it, but some of that may be what is shown in this poll is this deep cynicism about elites. I mean, now whether that's new or not is quite another matter. Many in the audience will be familiar with my favourite poll of all time. It's done not, unfortunately, by this organisation, because we didn't exist in August 1944, but the Gallup survey of the British public about whether or not they believed British parliamentarians were acting in the interest of the country. And in August 1944, only 35% believed that British parliamentarians were acting in the interest of the country. The rest were acting in their own interests or in their political party's interests. So it's not a new thing. It is more extreme at the moment, but it's there, and of course at these moments of tension, as we've discussed, the opportunists, perhaps rather than the populists, are able to, who can capture the mood with style, can win.
Henri, I saw a raised eyebrow there.
I wanted to say something about the concept of elite and the concept of perception, again, versus reality. Because it depends from your point of view. You can be a billionaire and not come across as elite, because you are not a civil servant, because you have not been a member of the government, because you had a different itinerary. Another way to look at this is about wealthy people. You have seen lots of debate where there are lots of criticism about high pays from top executives, and a debate on soccer game players makes fortune as well, but that's okay, and that's not okay on the other side, and why? And it depends on who looks at this. So it's not about an objective definition of the elite. It's about a perception of what makes you a so-called elite, legitimate or not legitimate. In a way, for some voters, he succeeded, he made lots of money, he knows business, I can rely on him, he will be effective. And it's not the number of millions of dollars someone has in the bank or in assets. It's about how he's perceived, and it's about perception, that you are an elitist person, whether you have lots of money or not lots of money, high education, not education, wealthy parents, not wealthy parents, etc. So the concept of perception plays an important role in all this, and it's very, very necessary not to forget it.
I think it's often the case that when people say elite, we hear, if you're on the left, you hear money and position, but often when people say metropolitan liberal elite, they're not talking about that, they're talking about an attitude or a set of views or a set of shared perceptions of the world, and that's what they're talking about when they say elite.
I want to sort of...
Is nativism a posh word for racism?
Yeah. Posh meaning...
Oh, sorry.
Port out,
No,
starboard home.
I get it. I can translate. Is nativism another word for racism? I would say no. And I think that, to be quite frank, that's why all of us have misunderstood the trend that we're seeing in front of us. And, everyone here is a nativist. And so if you take the specific definition of nativist, it's just putting some sort of premium in terms of policy on native-born versus foreign-born. I think everyone, unless you're a radical libertarian, would say that probably people would need a visa to come into the country. The question is, where do you fall along that continuum? Like, how much restriction should be there? And ultimately, what Trump, let's talk about the United States, what Trump is tapping into is a belief among people that their country, America, they should have control and self-determination about who they are. And I give and this is where I go back to saying it's cultural, it's about identity politics. And I'll give a very, very sort of anecdotal example, but our quantitative polling and our qualitative polling in the US shows this over and over again. So my son, I have a number of children, my older son wrestles. And wrestling in the United States, at least, is kind of a working class sport. We don't live in a working class place, but it's a working class sport. I live in suburban Washington, D.C. I live in Maryland, actually, a very posh place. Relatively posh place, let's put it that way. When we go to a wrestling meet in Potomac, Maryland, where I live, everyone before the match stands up. They play the national anthem. Everyone stands. People put their hands on their heart. Now, it's very cosmopolitan, so we have a lot of foreigners. They're not American, but they're respectful. Americans will put their hands on their heart. Foreigners who aren't American will stand and be respectful. Some people sing it. Whatever. It is, in some ways, pro forma, and it's symbolic, obviously, but to the people there, it's not so ingrained in their psyche. If you go 40 miles down into Virginia, Fort Royal, Virginia, once again, we wrestle all over the place, and especially in working class and rural places. You go to Fort Royal, Virginia, when the national anthem plays, everyone stands at attention. Those that have been in the military salute, and everyone sings. It's an amazing distinction. And the point being is, this nativism is, we all fall along the nativist continuum. There's those that support Trump that want much more restrictions, those that don't, which want less. But for those that support Trump, it's about national identity and saying we have a right, we should have a voice about the sort of America we want. Now, I'm not making a value judgment here, and you could have a negative and pejorative view of that, but I would not classify nativism as racism. I think it's not the case specifically. It's not correlated with racist measures when you look at it specifically. And more importantly, from a conceptual standpoint, I think if we do that, we turn off our lenses and our eyes, and we don't understand what the other, in this case, those who support Trump, actually feel and believe.
Thank you very much. Did you want to come in on this?
Just a few words about the last part of my speech. I think there is a risk, in Italy. The risk is that during the electoral campaign, traditional parties, instead of react in a strong way against the populism, are tempted to adopt in some way a populist style to increase their support or popularity. And I think maybe if all the political parties became populist, this means maybe the end of populism. That might be a way out.
It's the most novel solution so far to populism that we found. I just wanted to bring you in, Mary, on this question about why isn't left-wing populism so successful? Because South African populism is not necessarily what we recognise as right-wing.
No, it is definitely not right-wing populism, but it's also not left-wing populism. I do think on the political spectrum, the economic freedom fighters are definitely more on the left of the ANC, but there are parties to their left as well. And some of their claims are very radical, like some of their land claims, that it's not an issue in the country. If you ask people what are the biggest issues in the country, nobody will mention land, but they make it an issue. So I think a lot of the populist parties probably get something to hook their identity on, and they very much go for that, and they make all their messages about it, and they will drive that agenda very strongly. But to call it left-wing populism, I'm not comfortable with that.
We could probably carry on all night along these themes, but with one eye on the clock, I'm afraid we have to stop here. But if you want to carry on the conversation, do head back downstairs where you probably started off with your reception. There is more drinks, more canapes, and certainly more ideas and more chat and more argument to be had. So thank you very much to all of our distinguished panel. Thank you very much to you for coming and for your fantastic